But today's session is going to be about using a tool called SkillBlox that was developed actually not intentionally, but it was released right at the time of the start of the pandemic to find and organize math resources. And I have to just give a shout out to Chuck and the team at the Pennsylvania Distance Learning Project because this work, or some of this work in terms of the format of what we've created and where we are going, was inspired by his team's effort early on, starting in 2014, I guess, when Standards in Action came to be, and the team at the Distance Learning Project had started doing curriculum alignment resource work to sort of make sure that the units of study that were being delivered to students truly matched and fully covered the college and career readiness standards, and using sort of some of the great work that they had done and formats for ensuring that for their students is actually part of the inspiration of what this tool SkillBlox does. And so we're going to get into that. One thing that I will just mention out of the gate is that we are going to be very rapidly going through, because we only have an hour together, how to use the SkillBlox platform. So we are going to do a start to finish walkthrough. I'm actually going to, as I'm talking right now, I'm going to share in the chat the link to SkillBlox, just so if you are interested in actually playing along as we do this work and I do the walkthrough, you are more than welcome to. So I'm going to put this in the chat. There is a very brief setup for a free account within SkillBlox, and all of the resources in SkillBlox are free. SkillBlox itself is free, as Chuck mentioned. So if you want to do that on the side as I'm talking, feel free. In about 20 minutes, we'll actually be diving into the walkthrough of SkillBlox. But what I was going to say earlier is we're going to be working pretty quickly through that how-to for a sort of more relaxed pace walkthrough of how to use SkillBlox and how to get set up in SkillBlox. There is a link here that, again, you'll get this deck after the session that includes tutorials. There's a series of 7 tutorials actually that total about 25 minutes that walk through each of the steps that we're in detail that we're going to be doing pretty rapidly here today, as well as some webinars that we had done right out of the gate when we released SkillBlox last year that sort of provide guidance in terms of each of those steps, as well as more comprehensive, advanced, I guess, skill around blended learning, which we will also be talking about today. So what we're going to do today is an introduction to SkillBlox, and as I said, we're going to do a hands-on site tour and walkthrough of how to get set up, as well as a quick overview of the content that's actually in SkillBlox. SkillBlox is a tool that aggregates resources from multiple different websites to make it easier for you to find the resources that you might want to use for math instruction. We're then going to just sort of look at the different ways that you might use SkillBlox to organize and share content with your learners, and even design lessons for your learners and different activities revolving around the resources that you can find in SkillBlox. And then finally, we're going to talk about some of the new features that are being built into SkillBlox. Again, we released SkillBlox in March of 2020, and this was actually at that point when Crowded Learning, which is the name of the organization that developed it and that I was a part of, was still its own organization. Since the point of March, and with all that has happened in the past year and all of the need around providing guidance on how to use digital resources and online and open education resources, we actually became part of the EdTech Center World Education in September of 2020, which has been a wonderful move and a wonderful partnership, because now we actually are tied into lots of their initiatives, which span both the United States and the world, and because of that, have access to funding and grant opportunities that are going to allow us to actually build upon what I'm going to show you today, so that in fall, by the time that you're back, for some of you, if you're taking a summer break, when you're back, there's going to be all sorts of new features and new content areas beyond math in SkillBlox. So very excited about that. So very quickly, I'm just going to talk about what SkillBlox is. And as I mentioned earlier, we started out this journey as Crowded Learning. And Crowded Learning was an organization that we founded in 2017 that was really looking at a mission of increasing the awareness of and use of open education resources, or OER, within adult education. And so we had sort of a three-pronged approach to doing that. One was simply expanding awareness, finding out what is out there, what is being used effectively by adult educators, and making the field aware of what could be used that was freely available and open. We also have been and continue to provide professional development around promoting specific effective resources and strategies for actually using those resources. That has been particularly important in the past year, and my hope is that as we sort of pivot to quote unquote the new normal, we're all taking some of the lessons learned in the past year and not just throwing away all of the great work and great innovation that we've all done in the midst of sort of forced immersion into technology and remote instruction, but that we've actually found some things that actually work well, not just in remote settings, but also in in-person and or blended learning settings. And then as part of sort of that process of both finding really great resources and strategies for using them, given that, as I said, tools like SkillBlox aggregate resources from multiple different websites, we've played around a lot with experimenting with ways to share and deliver content, which is what SkillBlox really is, one big experiment, but then also with the processes around finding resources that are available and curating really quality resources that they're more easily available to teachers and students and readily able to be used. So as part of those sort of initiatives that we started out of the gate with, our first mission was to just see what was being used by adult educators. And in the process of doing national surveys and going to conferences and polling teachers, we built up sort of a directory, or a set of actually 12 directories of free and open education resources across 12 different subject areas. So academic subject areas such as reading, math, social studies, science, and language arts. Employability skills around communication and essential workplace skills and career pathways. And then lifelong learning skills such as health, digital, and financial literacy, as well as information literacy, which is obviously critically important as we've seen in the past few years. And so all of these are available as directories of resources. So they're basically, as you can see here, there's 3 samples. These are all downloadable and editable. They provide information about each of the websites and tools within. There's curriculum resources, there's assessment resources, there's games, there's vocabulary resources for each of the subject areas. But it's still sort of, we're pointing you to, hey, go to this website and find stuff. And so that still takes teachers time to sort of see if things are relevant, see if things are aligned to the skills that they need to teach. And so our next step after doing that was this experiment called SkillBlox. And the notion of SkillBlox was simply this. What if instead of you as a teacher having to go to your publisher materials and having to go to online resources like the ones that show up here on your screen, where all of these publishers provide their alignments to the college and career readiness standards, for example, and as you know, as the standards in action state, you then have to sort of pick through and see, does this resource actually fully cover a particular standard? But they at least do point you to resources that align, or activities and lessons that align to each of the standards. On the left-hand side, you see all of these open education resources that are really high quality. And in many cases, I come from the publishing world, so I can say this, I feel more engaging than some of the resources that are provided by publishers. However, they don't necessarily provide the specific alignments, or they do, but they're to the Common Core state standards. But what if we actually took the alignments that are either provided already, or if we built alignments to comprehensive resources like Khan Academy and Flexbooks and Math is Fun and PhET, which has great simulations, and we pulled those all together into essentially a database and allowed for all of that to be organized in one place. So instead of having to go to these PDFs from the publishers and some download from, say, Khan Academy, which does have a downloadable Excel sheet of their alignment of everything, but now you have to poke through all that, find specific resources and standards, and then check them out. What if all that was in one place? So you could actually go to the skill that you want to teach and then see what from all of these different resources actually align to that skill. And so as part of that standards and action work that I was talking about earlier that Chuck and the distance learning project team were doing, they were doing that manually, and they were compiling that in spreadsheets, finding resources that align to standards, and then adding them so that they could provide more comprehensive coverage. So what if instead of having to manually do that, it was already done? So we first started by partnering with the major publishers within adult education, at least print publishers. And part of this was because I come, again, from a publishing background. I worked with McGraw-Hill for 8 years in adult education. And I saw how the world worked. I saw that teachers want to see how does this math workbook align to the TABE test? And so they were very adept at looking at our content, looking at our alignments, or even our table of contents, and then looking at a student score report from the TABE test and kind of highlighting the specific things, the lessons from the book that they needed to work on. So we started by asking them to provide their alignments in digital format. So instead of the piece of paper, actually having a spreadsheet that has all of their alignments. And then we built spreadsheets or CSV files that have all of the alignments of things such as Khan Academy or the other resources that I showed on the previous screen. And essentially what that does for us then is allows us, and this literally pulls from a presentation Chuck and I did together about 4 years ago around what he and his team have done in Canvas, where they take the lessons from the online curriculum that they use for their GED program, and they list those as these are the lessons that you need to do for this particular unit. So in this case with SkillBlox, you have the ability to locate any resources for which we have the alignments to from the publisher print materials, and then you can also add in free and open education resources. So what this allows you to do is augment the sort of core or anchor curriculum you might be using with additional resources that can provide learner extensions or remediation as needed. And the reason that this was sort of a goal of ours was twofold. One, as I said earlier, when I've seen for years teachers taking our materials and doing that, like finding the specific lessons that aligned with the skills, the hope was that if our mission is to increase awareness of and use of open education resources, if we sort of just have all of those resources right there, then in the same action of saying, do these 2 lessons from your print materials, hopefully a teacher will go, well, I could add these Khan Academy lessons, and I could add this Math is Fun lesson. And so we're taking things one step closer to teachers actually using some of these really rich and engaging online and open education resources. The other reason for this, as I've said a couple times now, and as I mentioned, Chuck and his team had worked with their GED curriculum to work on, is that this is a publisher material. It's a relatively new publisher resource that aligns to the TABE test. And this particular lesson focuses on lines, rays, and angles. Well, if you look at this content, it definitely aligns to the skill and the standard. And the standard is identify angles, so acute, right, and obtuse angles, parallel and perpendicular lines, and raised lines and line segments in 2-dimensional figures, and draw them. Well, if I look at this lesson, this does an absolutely great job of providing an overview of all of those things, the angles, the lines, the rays, the line segments, perpendicular and parallel lines. It does that. It provides a definition, it provides examples, and it does provide some practice on identifying. But what is not happening in any of these problems in the practice section is students drawing these, which is kind of half of the standard, right? And so if that's the case, then the teacher, this doesn't mean you throw away this lesson. This is a great reference. This provides some practice on students identifying these various geometric figures or properties. But we have to provide students with that opportunity to draw. And so with SkillBlox, you can have the lessons that you might be using from your curriculum materials, but then just by adding in the Khan Academy resources that are in SkillBlox, you can see that for each of those things, for raised lines and line segments, there's identify and then there's draw them. For parallel and perpendicular lines, there's identify and draw. And for angle types, there's identify angle types and draw them. And so by sort of marrying your curricular resources that you're using and adding in some of these free and open education resources and putting them together in one place, this allows you to augment that learning and provide greater coverage and depth of learning for students. So in terms of the current platform, we have these 5 open education resources. Math is Fun is not an open education resource, but we do have permission to include them within SkillBlox. And amongst these, there's over 2,000 unique standards aligned free and open education resources that do all sorts of different things. It's not just sort of one way of teaching. And that's the other thing, is SkillBlox is really designed to address the fact that there is no one-size-fits-all resource that's going to help every single learner. So amongst all of these resources, there's lessons that are sort of more traditional, there's activities, there's simulations, games, and videos, there's interactive practice, with tools like Khan Academy, and more. And so this link, which again, I would actually jump at it into this so you can see, but for some reason, my IT department did something to my computer and I can no longer see Wakelet, which is like literally cutting my hands off because I use Wakelet all the time. But we have a Wakelet that you'll get with these slides and the link for this that has details on all the resources that we have within SkillBlox, but then also a number of other free and open education resources that aren't currently in SkillBlox, but we hope to add in the coming year. So now we're going to go into our little hands-on tour, and hopefully you have had the opportunity to create an account. But again, if you just want to watch and learn and then sort of come back to this at a later time, please feel free to do so. But just a quick primer in terms of how SkillBlox works is, first, as I said, we built SkillBlox based on the College and Career Readiness standards, at least for math. That was the basis in terms of how we organize content. And so if you use the College and Career Readiness standards, which I believe you do, you know there's 5 levels, they have grade level equivalencies, and these are how they relate to NRS levels. And so within the standards, the way things are organized for math at least are there's a domain, there's a subdomain, and then there are standards. And so the way that you actually navigate content within SkillBlox is first you start with the level or levels of your learners, and then you sort of go in this order. So first, domain. So there's like across all of the levels, there range from like 5 to like 13 domains in math within each of the different levels. So things like operations in algebraic thinking, geometry, measurement, number-based 10, fractions, functions. Those are all sort of the domains, and different levels have different domain structures. And then there's subdomains. And so within the standards, again, these are sort of overarching topics, if you will, within this domain of operations and algebraic thinking. One that might be more sort of relevant or tangible to folks is within, say, geometry. there's one subdomain on properties of figures, and then there's another subdomain on the coordinate plane, which is different than sort of those properties, but they are all related to geometry. And then under the subdomains, you'll see that sometimes there's multiple standards within a subdomain, or in some subdomains, there might just be one standard, as is the case with these two subdomains. So this is basically how you will navigate content and get to the resources within SkillBlox. And so what you'll see in a second is you can click on a level, and then you can see the domains, and then you can click on a subdomain. And then when you do that, you'll see all of the related learning activities that are aligned to the standards in that subdomain. And then you can filter those resources by the various provider, and then you can select the resources that or activities that you want to use. And with the publisher resources, you do first, and I'll show you how to do this, have to indicate that you have access to say the McGraw-Hill book or the New Reader's Press book or the Paxson Publishing book, right? So those aren't default included in what you see. You as a teacher have to go to this place where you'll see, and you just basically add the books that you have in your classroom or in your resource library, so that basically tells SkillBlox, this is a book that my students have access to. I want to see what lessons or what pages align to standards when I navigate and search for skills within SkillBlox. Right now, the way it works is what you do is you create a skill block, and then you share a code with students. And then when they enter that code, they are launched into the skill block that you have created. There are no student accounts in the current version. We are moving towards that. So by the fall or soon thereafter, we will actually have student accounts, so that not only they don't have to enter in the codes each time, but they can actually save skill blocks that have been assigned to them. And just another point before we dive in, all of the resources within SkillBlox are mobile friendly, and that was very intentional and by design. As we all have become aware, and probably were aware even before the pandemic, a sizable portion of our learners are mobile dependent for internet access. And so it's really critical that the resources that we are pointing them towards allow them to actually access this. So now we are going to go through the following steps. And again, this is going to be pretty fast. There is a playlist that walks through them in sort of slower sequence, but we're going to create the instructor account, which you actually hopefully have already done. I'm not going to go through that step, but it's pretty straightforward. You basically provide an email and create a password. And then we're going to do that process of finding a skill that you teach, which I just showed you a little bit of, how you select learning activities to add to your skill blocks. How do you add print resources? So how do you indicate which publisher materials you have so that those show up for you when you're searching skills? And then how to organize the resources and activities within your skill blocks, and then how to share your skill blocks. Okay. So I'm going to hop out, and I'm going to go to the SkillBlox login page. Now I'm going to I have it set so that it automatically remembers me. But just so you know, on the SkillBlox login page, and I'll grab this and paste it again, in case people joined after I shared the link the first time. If you do not have an account, you just go to sign up and provide your first name, last name, email address, password, confirm it. We do have questions that follow, and that's just basically we want to find out like what levels of teachers are working with SkillBlox or using SkillBlox. What are the levels of students that you're working with? And this is really partly for us to go after more funding so that we can expand upon SkillBlox so that we know sort of how it's being used. But once I've created my account, and I'm going to go to, I think I have one like this. All right, I'm going to delete this skill block that I created, and I'm just going to, well, we won't. we'll do this after. So when you arrive at SkillBlox for the first time, this is what you will see. Pretty much nothing. This page is actually called My SkillBlox, and what you'll see is you haven't created any SkillBlox, and so you have to create one. So going back to that that lesson that we showed a second ago on angles and line segments and such, I'm going to add a skill block or create a skill block that focuses on that particular standard. And I happen to know that that is CCRS level C and it's geometry. So I'm going to add a, whoops, was there a question?
Yes, it is.
I guess that wasn't a question.
So yes, how are you?
Skill blocks. And
Yes,
I have my levels over here. And then what you'll see is these are all of the domains across all 5 levels. So if I go to level A, I'm going to see there's only 4 domains, right? This is table level L, actually. And actually, just so you know, the corresponding table levels are L, E, M, D, and A. I know that gets really confusing, but that's the sort of pairing between the CCRS and table levels. So if I go to E, I'll deselect that and go to E, you're going to see that these are sort of your high school level or things that you're going to see, say, on a GED test. So we're getting into algebra and functions and statistics and things along those lines. What you'll also see is that if I go to, say, level C, these are the 9 domains in level C. But then I can also add in level D. So you can create skill blocks that pull in resources from multiple levels. And it will sort of pull those things together in one place for you. But we're going to focus just on level C. And I'm going to go to geometry. And I'm going to go to the subdomain. Remember, these are the domains, and these are the subdomains. So I'm going to go to the subdomain that focuses on lines and angles. And when I go over, click on that, I see that there's 23 resources in my library, which includes some publisher resources that I've already added in this account, but I'll show you how to do that in a second, that align to the standard or standards within this domain. If you want to see the standard, you can just click on this little standard square here, and it says what the domain, the subdomain, and the standard is. So this is that one that I was talking about, drawing them and identifying them in 2-dimensional figures. If you remember, that lesson that we were looking at didn't really provide any drawing of it. And so what you'll see on the right-hand side is all of the activities across the resources that are either in SkillBlox, the default library, or in the print resources that I've added. And again, on day 1, you would not have these print resources added. This is an account that I had created previously, so I've already added some things in. And all I have to do now is search through to see the things that I might want to do. So maybe I actually just want to focus on angles. So instead of line segments raised parallel and perpendicular lines, although they're related, I want to create a very specific skill block on angles. So I'm going to grab the resources that focus on angles. And just some math is fun lessons. Now, one of the things you'll note is I can filter to the specific resources I want to use. So these are all of the math is fun lessons, and go to right angles, and so that covers that. And then I could say jump to Khan Academy and see which of these resources aligns. And so that's it. So I've got all of those from those 2. So the other thing just to note is, say I wanted to do angle types, so identifying and drawing them, but angles, obviously identifying them and drawing them is one thing, but there's this other part of that, which is measuring them. So I could go to my measurement and data domain, and I see that there's a standard on geometric measurement and angles. And so now I can add that in. So I've got my geometry domain and the lessons that I've added. And now I can collapse that, and I can see that these are my measurement lessons. And so you'll see within this subdomain, there's actually multiple standards. So there's recognizing angles, There's recognizing angles as additive. That might be a little bit more advanced than what I want to focus on. And then there's this one, which is measuring angles. So maybe I want to find all of the resources that align to measuring angles, which is for MD6, so that I can have this skill block that has both identifying and drawing angles, but then also measuring. Now you'll see some things are already selected. In this case, it's because they also aligned to that geometry standard that I was looking at. So I'm going to grab a couple of these. And this is one on using a protractor. That might be a very important lesson. And I'm going to add those. And so now you'll see I've selected a total of 14 activities. And those are now in my skill blocks that I have created. I just zoomed out just so you can see all of them. Now, I can rearrange these in whatever order I want just by grabbing this, which is called the hamburger menu. And I just like saying that because it's summer and I've probably had 10 hamburgers already since Memorial Day. But you can drag them, you can move them around. And then you can give your skill block a name. And I'm going to call this identify, draw, and measure angles. Now we're going to get into, in a second, sort of the approach that you might take to organizing these resources and sharing them with students. But one thing I'll note is, and I'll cover this in a second, but maybe you just want to use this as a tool for you to find resources. You don't want to share this skill block with students, but you want to find a resource that you might use for an activity. I can, with any of these resources, like so say using a protractor, take a look at it. So this is a great activity that both has these animations that show how you use a protractor to draw angles, and then a simulation that sort of shows how you use a protractor to measure angles. So you'll see they bring the protractor back up so that you can see that. And then there's this interactivity where I can actually use this sort of virtual protractor here to actually measure the angles in this triangle and get sort of feedback as to whether or not I did it correctly. So it's got all of the things, right? These are simulations. So maybe this is something you want students to play with ahead of class. You can actually click this copy icon here, and it's going to copy that URL to the clipboard, and then you could paste that as a Google Classroom assignment. You could paste it in Remind. You could share it however it is you might share these things with students. So maybe you're using it just as a curricular resource as opposed to rearranging these things and sharing this whole skill block with students. What I want to show now is how you would add publisher resources. So as I said, I've already added some to my library. When you go to add a skill block, you're going to see all of the free and open resources that are in the default library. If you want to add things to your SkillBlox library, you go to Manage Library. This is where you can find all of the publisher resources for which there are alignments. So all I have to do is click on Add Print Resources, and now I can go and say I know the title of one of my books, say Number Power. So again, I work from McGraw-Hill at one point in time. So I can see all of the Number Power books that are in here. So if I have Number Power Geometry, I can click on that, or say I have the whole Number Power series. I just want to go through and click them all. And there's actually more. I can select them and then save it. So now those are all in my library, along with some of these other resources that I had already added. And what this is doing is just telling SkillBlox, again, I have these books. My students have access to these books. When I look at a skill in SkillBlox and I want to create a skill block, I want to see what lessons and activities from each of these materials that I have align to that skill so that I can add those into my skill block. So if I go back to the one that I just created and I open it, I can select more learning activities for it. And that was a McGraw-Hill resource, Number Power. And so you'll see that there's a number of lessons from the number power geometry book that align to these two skills. And so I could add them. Maybe I just want 6 because that's the one that focuses on measuring angles. And so now when I save, those are going to get added in as well. The default here is that when you add a resource, it goes in alphabetical order. And if you've already done rearranging, as I've done here, it's going to keep that, and then any resources that you add to the skill blocks will just plop in at the bottom so that it doesn't disrupt what you've already created. But that's basically it in terms of how you find resources, how you add things to your library, and then how you actually go about organizing the resources within your skill blocks. In terms of sharing this actual skill block with students, I can preview to see what it will look like. I can also print it. And this is really nice because what this allows you to do, I know teachers really love, print, and maybe that's a little different now that we've been remote for a year, but sometimes having that nice hard copy of something feels good. But say in the instance that you as a teacher want to provide options for students to be working on the skills that you know they're all going to need, right? If, say, Chuck creates all of the geometry level C skill blocks that he feels are needed for students, and I create all the ones in, say, measurement or number-based 10, I could print these out, have them available to students, and then as students need specific skills, they can just, I can hand them the one that they need, and all they need to do is go to skillblocks.org and then enter this code. And then it will direct them to this particular skill block. So I'm going to share that code in the chat here. And if you want to, whoops, that didn't work, go to skillblocks.org and you enter in that code, which is 379RB2. It is case sensitive. You're going to see the skill block that I just created. I'm going to log out here. I'm going to paste that in. And so as a student now, I see this skill block. And again, we don't have an app, but it is mobile friendly, and all of the resources are mobile friendly as well. And so basically when a student opens this up on their phone, they will be able to click on any of these links and launch into the resources. Now, some just points of note, it does not track time. Within, skill blocks. This is not a learning management system. There are, again, no student accounts currently, but there will be. But even when we do get to that point, we are going to sort of be slow in terms of figuring out what type of learner tracking makes sense in terms of resource completion. One of the things that we know we will be doing in the coming year is where students will be able to rate the resources. That they'll be able to mark that they've completed a resource, and they'll be able to actually indicate how helpful they found the resource. And this is going to perform two sort of functions for us. That down the road, when you're looking at that list of activities that align to this skill, you will also see how students have rated those resources, or how many people have used those resources, or added those resources to their skill blocks. Because that's the way of the world, right? That when you see that recipe online and there's 2 recipes from different sites on the same dish that you want to make, say, stuffed jalapeno pepper, grilled stuffed jalapeno peppers, it's summer, right? And you see one that has 2 ratings total and a 5.0, 5 stars. And you see another that has 450 ratings and a 4.8. It's a lower sort of rating. It got a lower sort of number of stars, but there was also 450 people that rated it that way. So you're more likely to try out that recipe because of the volume of use and the way in which people have rated it, as opposed to the one that has a 5.0, but only 2 people have rated it, and likely that is the person who actually posted the recipe and their best friend. Right? And so we're adding in functionality to sort of support further your ability to more readily find resources that are going to be relevant to your learners and effective for your learners. And a lot of what that process includes is around crowdsourcing. And in this case, it's crowdsourcing the ratings of people who have used them so that you have a better sense of its effectiveness. Within what we're going to be able to do in the fall and things that we're adding is, in addition to being able to print this out in this format, we will actually, there'll be auto-generated somewhere on here, probably here, because it's nice blank space here, a QR code so that you can have this printout. And maybe, I don't know if in Pennsylvania you've had this, but in Chicago, everyone's using QR codes now, finally. I've always loved them on their menus because they didn't want people touching the menus. But on any of these printouts, you'll have that QR code so that the student can just scan it with their smartphone, and it will open up the SkillBlox. So they won't even have to go to SkillBlox and enter in that code. They'll be able to scan it and add it to their account because, again, as I said, we will have accounts coming in the fall. So that's sort of the walkthrough of how to use SkillBlox. Again, in the resources that will be provided, there is a YouTube playlist that shows all of those steps in much more detail. So now I'm just going to talk about, with the 15 minutes we have left, some strategies for, I just showed you how to just throw a bunch of things in a skill block. But as you've probably realized over the past year, certain resources lend themselves to different sort of modes of learning, and certain resources are more relevant than others for what it is you're trying to accomplish with your students. And so in the slides, actually, I just want to point out, I've hidden a sequence of slides that I'm not going to walk through today because we only have an hour, but these actually provide some details on each of the free and open education resources that are in SkillBlox. If we had more time, I'd walk through each of these so you understand what Flexbooks are and you understand what CK12 is, which I believe you may have learned about CK12, which is one of the resources in SkillBlox at a session this morning. If I'm not mistaken, Chuck had told me that. So those are in this slide file that you'll have, but I'm not going to spend time walking through them because of time. But in terms of thinking about ways to be building SkillBlox and strategies for using SkillBlox with your learners. One of the things you'll see is different resources within SkillBlox lend themselves to different types of learning. And so PhET, which is a open licensed set of online simulations, it really lends itself to conceptual exploration and having students sort of tinker with things like a scale where you can add fruit on either side, and then you realize that, say, 2 apples or 2 bananas equals 1 orange, right? And so you mark it and say, okay, equality in this case is 1 orange equals 2 bananas. And so what if you add another orange? What do you need to do on the other side of the scale in order to make it balance again? You need to add 2 more bananas, or you could add another orange. But it is an exploration and a simulation that helps students dive into the concept of equality. And so it's a great resource, and all of the activities from PhET are great for conceptual exploration. Math is Fun also has great tools for that as well, including the protractor activity and simulation that I shared with you just a second ago. There's other resources that focus really well and do a good job of instruction. So Math is Fun, you'll see in like the description for this Math is Fun resource, it's called an interactive. And in this case, here's a lesson and here's a lesson with video. So the lessons are focused more on instruction and providing sort of that walkthrough of the concept with students. The print resources are obviously really good at that in many cases, as is CK12 and Flexbooks and Khan Academy. But then Math is Fun also has independent games. And so that allows for additional practice or engagement with content, with the concepts, but in a more fun way, right? And so there's a number of games that you could add into a skill block. And then Khan Academy is the one that really provides just a great set of practice. And what's nice about Khan Academy, or the way it's linked in here, is we actually link to the Khan Academy, the practice, the assessments within each lesson. And within Khan Academy, if you're familiar with it, when you start a practice set, it shows the problem, and then there's two links at the bottom that say need a hint, and actually point you to a video that shows the related lesson. So you could use the Khan Academy practice sets as a pretest, if you will, or a concept check for students to see if they need to content because maybe they already know that skill, or you could use it as a summative for that skill block to see if they've actually generated it. And as I mentioned earlier, all of these can be shared in whatever way makes sense for you. You can share the direct link or you can share the code. In our sort of down the road, not fall, but probably spring of 2021, wow, years, you just fly by. You're going to actually be able to embed a skill block into your LMS. But right now, you could share a skill block or even the individual activities in all of these different ways. And so as I mentioned earlier, you might just be using it as a curriculum reference to see the things that align and then do with them as you wish. You might choose to rearrange the resources within skill blocks as I did, very rudimentarily, like that was not a full-blown sort of thoughtful organization that I did, but putting them in the order that say you want students to work through them. And then share that skill block as is. Or as I mentioned earlier, you might grab the individual activities by copying them and then sharing those out using whatever tools you see fit. And so as you start playing with skill blocks and looking at the various tools within there, you're going to start seeing that there's, again, those different ways that you could use the resources. And so that protractor activity that I shared, that interactivity, that is one that students could do on their own. They could explore the concepts with that. You could also use that as a sort of doing, it's recorded right now, but during a live remote instruction class, or if you have a projector in class, you can still use that same resource and project it, right? So that's part of one of the things that I've been saying from the beginning is that think about not just how to use these because it's like, oh my goodness, we need resources to share with students now because they're remote, but be thoughtful about, well, building skill blocks or whatever it is you're building, using skill blocks as a resource to find activities in such a way that what you build is not just for that we're in this emergency remote setting, but when we go back to quote unquote normal, I can still use this activity to model the concept of measuring angles using your protractor. I could also send it out ahead of time and have students explore it and play with it and see if, see how well or not well they are able to use the protractor. And then Khan Academy, again, if I was going to go to measure angles, I would see both of these resources. And so the Math is Fun resource I could use to model and provide students with the ability to explore the concept. And then I could assign the Khan Academy practice set, which has them not only having to draw the angles or line up, in this case, as you can see, the angle to create a right angle in this case, but then they also have to identify why that is a right angle. So it's getting at identifying the property of a right angle and then also drawing a right angle. And so both of these resources are really relevant. You could also use skill blocks to create standalone lessons. Now, a tool that I like to do that with is Wakelet, where you can copy the resources that you want to use and then put them into a sequence within Wakelet. What's nice about Wakelet is you can add sort of sections. So let's say learn or explore or play or practice, and then put the resources in sort of order within a Wakelet, which is also shareable with students. Here are two Wakelets that I've created as sort of samples. And again, the links, I'll share the link if you want to pop in and check it out. I unfortunately can't show Wakelet right now for some reason. But these are Wakelets that I created using skill blocks. So I found the skill that I wanted to teach. I added the resources to my skill block that I wanted to use. And then I just copied and pasted them into Wakelet. so that I can provide a shareable lesson with students. But you could also use the activities within SkillBlox and design activities around the resources that you find. So I am going to hop into both of these because, again, it's not just about throwing things at students, but being mindful about how we want to actually have students using them. So these are two flipped learning activities that I've created, and I did this through finding aligned resources in SkillBlox and then using Padlet created these activities to send out ahead of time. What you'll notice is these are activities that students could do on their own with just basic understanding of the concepts. So one is on angles, one is on order of operations. But by way of doing this and having students respond ahead of time, what results from that is students understand and have a sense of what they're going to be covering in class the next time we get together, but they've also spent time thinking about and sharing ideas or examples around the concepts, which allows for me to start class with those responses already in Padlet so that we can actually have a discussion as a class around their responses and have students explain their thinking or one another's thinking. So one of these activities, I'll copy this link address, is around angles. And so the way that I created this was I found these Math is Fun angle lessons, right? So there's an overview of the right angles, obtuse angles, and acute angles. And here I provided directions. So find something in your house that is an angle. Find an example of each angle, and then take a picture of that right angle, that obtuse angle, and that acute angle, and then add your photos in here. And you actually, if you want to do this right now, you have the ability to do so, where you could find something in your house, and these are all submissions from other teachers that I've sort of done this similar presentation with, that they have found within their house. So they've taken a picture of something in their house. Here's a great example, because I could ask somebody to point out, okay, this person says this is an acute angle. So where is the acute angle? Are there other angles that are in this picture? Because we're seeing both acute and obtuse angles. And so now you're getting into actually concepts such as supplemental angles, which is really cool. Here's another one where the same thing. So there's acute angles, but there's also an obtuse angle in here. But these are all pictures that have been shared by people who saw this presentation and decided they wanted to add things. So again, I started with SkillBlox. I found resources related to angles. I chose the one that I feel provides a nice overview of the concept, and pasted those into Padlet, and then created a flipped activity for students. The other one that I have in here is on order of operations. And I think, oh, here we go. I can copy that. And I'll paste this in the chat. And in this case, I actually went ahead and I created a Wakelet that used the resources from SkillBlox and made an order of operations lesson. But then I actually created this open-ended set of questions where students are viewing an array or different arrays, and they have to write an expression that helps say the total of the red and helps say the total of the green. And so what you'll see is you see 3 times 5, 5 times 3. You'll see 5 plus 5 plus 5. That's also an expression. So these are all different ways of saying it. So we can have a really great discussion around which one's 5 times 3, which one's 3 times 5, and why. Or why does 5 times 5 times 5 also work? So we're getting at how multiplication relates to addition. We're also getting at the commutative property, where it doesn't matter the order of your factors. And so by having an activity like this, where we're providing students with some background within an open-ended problem, students can dive into some conceptual understanding, and actually they can arrive at the properties without me having to directly state them. I could ask them to come up with the rule, and then I provide the language that says, well, what you're describing is called the commutative property of mathematics. And so these are all different ways that you could share a SkillBlox as is. You could take SkillBlox, create a specific lesson, or you could create activities with SkillBlox. And the thing that ties them together is SkillBlox eases the process by which you find these things. Now, one of the nice things is that coming in the fall, teachers will be able to add their own resources to SkillBlox. They'll be able to share their SkillBlox with other teachers who can make copies of them. So say you created that great Padlet activity, or you created a great Wakelet activity, you could add that into a SkillBlox, share it with another teacher, and then that teacher can make a copy of that so that they have and can adjust it as they see fit. And so the whole point of what I just walked through in terms of how to use these resources is to just note that as we go back to normal, hopefully some of you are seeing that you're probably going to be doing some online, some in person, some mix of both, right? And when we think about how to use these resources intentionally, we can start really building out activities that we can reuse over and over again that support things like blended learning. I could share a skill block or a Wakelet lesson that allows students to just work individually on their own. And then I could use Padlet or PhET and Zoom to create collaborative activities where students are actually responding within that Padlet to one another, or lead a whole class discussion around something. The two webinars that I'd point out, and these are both actually in the SkillBlox YouTube playlist that dive deeper into what we just covered, our strategies for sharing SkillBlox. And then there's a 90-minute webinar that we did on blended learning using SkillBlox. So thinking about some of those things that I just showed you, but diving a little deeper into those concepts. So while we have, I know we only have 2 minutes left, but I just want to share with you where we are going with SkillBlox. And just in general, crowded learning, which is, as I said, now part of the EdTech Center at World Education. In the midst of the pandemic, we also piloted a process called this EdTech Makerspace, where we engage teachers in professional development, and as they are learning about different concepts or how to use tools, say like Quizlet or Google Forms, they're actually creating resources, and we orient them into sort of creating resources around, say, a curriculum. So one project we did in the summer of last year was took a leveled reading library called the Marshall, what's called Reading Skills for Today's Adults, and we taught teachers how to create Quizlets using the vocabulary from those stories, of which there's 345. And we taught teachers how to use Google Forms to create comprehension quizzes using the comprehension questions that were already in the library, but were in a Microsoft Word document. And in doing so, we had 44 teachers that in 2 months or 10 weeks created 1,000 learning resources that now are part of this sort of enhanced library, so that each story doesn't just have a Word document that has activities that you can print out in the story, but it has an interactive vocabulary Quizlet, and it has a Google Form quiz so that students can get immediate feedback on each of those stories. The point of that is that we've sort of been tinkering with this concept of getting teachers to crowdsource the generation of content that becomes available to everybody and freely available and adaptable to everybody. And so we're starting to do that in other areas like digital skills, where right now we're running a project where teachers are curating digital resources from different websites to a set of skills, so that in the fall, actually, we will have that library available, but that library will also be in SkillBlox. And so instead of just being math, we'll have digital literacy in SkillBlox. And so we're trying to basically figure out ways that we can engage educators in the process of helping to find, organize, and share resources that align to the skills that students need in different areas, all the while, again, making it very open so that you can use this tool in whatever way makes sense for you. And so, as I mentioned, we're adding digital literacy to SkillBlox. We're also adding in some of these other areas and others into SkillBlox. And so this content curation is going to be a big focus of our next year, as well as building in the back end, the ability for you to search these different topic areas based on what makes sense. For math, we have the standards. For these other areas, it's going to be based on sort of more topical hierarchies and reading levels and things like that. We're also, as I said, going to be adding the ability for teachers to add your own content, to share a skill block with other teachers. And as I mentioned a couple of times, adding student accounts. With adding student accounts, that doesn't just include teachers creating skill blocks and then students being able to add that skill block to their account, but also for the ability to students to self-explore topics of interest with resources that are student-facing, and being able to filter those resources in ways that make sense for them and set their preferences so that, say, learners just want to see videos, they can click on, this is not real what you're seeing, this is sort of a mock-up that we're playing with to just see what are the things that students might want to sort by and how do we present content. But basically by next year, students will be able to self-explore some of these areas and find resources based on the modality or the type of resource they want to look at, how long it is, how other students have rated it, whether it's mobile friendly, and other sort of fields. And the other thing that I just want to point out is what this will allow you to do as teachers once you can do this is, say one of you creates equivalent fractions lesson, and every state is focused on IET, right? And building more IET into your program. So one teacher creates this equivalent fraction lesson, and then someone focused on construction careers can add in resources around equivalent fractions that relate to construction. So measuring in woodworking projects, equivalent fractions is really important. Someone that might be working with culinary students or students who are focused on a culinary career track might add a performance-based problem that's focused on, say, doubling a cupcake recipe, which has fractions in the measurements for a catering order. So all of these are things that will be possible once teachers are able to add their own content and share skill blocks with other teachers. And once we actually add in other content areas, you'll be able to sort of integrate these skills within a skill block. So I showed you an example of math where we were combining both measurement and geometry concepts into the same skill block. But say I create a lesson or a skill block on positive and negative numbers. That relates to budgeting. So the Federal Trade Commission has great financial literacy resources in English and Spanish. This video is actually in English and Spanish. And this budgeting tool template is both in English and Spanish. So I might add that in. So we're covering a math concept and then covering a real life use of that math concept around financial literacy. GCF Learn Free also has a lesson on how to create a budget using spreadsheet tools such as Google Sheets and Microsoft Excel. And Google Applied Digital Skills has an actual whole sort of project-based lesson on creating a budget in Google Sheets. So you'll be able to sort of mix these areas of math and financial literacy, or even in this case, math and digital literacy, and create skill blocks that combine the two. And as I mentioned earlier, all of this is sort of, we want it to be geared by, sort of powered by the field and powered through learning and professional learning. So that as you're learning about open education resources or using new technology tools, you're generating resources, and we're curating resources together in our EdTech Makerspace projects. But these then go into skill blocks and then providing trainings, much like we really breezed through in our short time together, but how to actually characterize different resources that you could use and provide deeper standards-based instruction or blended learning by using the different resources in ways that provide a blended learning sequence for your learners. So the last thing I have, and this is it, is I mentioned that there's going to be opportunities for you to participate. And so we run a monthly set of distance education strategy sessions at the EdTech Center. They're the second and fourth Fridays of every month. This coming Friday is our very last one of the 2020-21 school year. which I really highly encourage you to attend because it's this charter school in Washington, D.C. that created an amazing set of learning resources for students on how to use the different ed tech tools that they would be using for remote instruction. Very well designed. They actually hired instructional designers to build these things, and they're in multiple languages, not even just English and Spanish, but others. They basically run a boot camp of students and provide these resources so that students can orient themselves to how to use the various tools to increase learner success. I mean, they're making all of those resources available to anybody to be able to use. So I encourage you to attend our last one of this past school year, this about to end school year. But then on June 25th, as I mentioned, we're currently in the process of doing a EdTech Makerspace around digital skills and curating digital skills. So we ran 2 3-hour sessions in May and June, and we're going to share out on June 25th the results of that work that was done by these teachers. And then we're going to basically launch what's called our summer maker camp, where instead of our second and fourth Fridays being distance education strategy sessions in July and August, there are going to be opportunities for teachers to come together and sort of arts and crafts our ideas around how to create what types of digital skills resources would be helpful for students. So things like designing a project-based assessment or an activity that has students applying a digital skill, or creating visual vocabulary cards for students. So we're going to basically be introducing different tools that can be used for those types of activities. And then we're going to play together and see what sticks in terms of good ideas for how to use those tools. And again, the idea being that as we find things that really work, and we should be scaling, providing opportunities for teachers to generate a bunch of resources in that same manner that ultimately can get added into SkillBlox so that we have this growing library of resources in different content areas. So I know I went over, and I know this was the last thing, so I want to thank you for sticking around for those of you who were able to. And I will open it up for any questions if people have them. I have time to stick around.